Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and joining us. As we just kind of wait for everyone to join us, we'll go ahead and get started. So this is our first Ptarmigan lecture of the year, and we're really excited to kick it off with Professor Jeremy Williams here from Bright Divinity School. Just before Professor Williams' talk, I just want to make a quick announcement that we actually have all of our old videos online at our new website, and it's ptarmigan.stanford.edu. So any of our old lectures are available to watch, and you can access them at your leisure. And as we kind of move forward, we'll be sure to kind of upload them accordingly. Yeah, and without further ado, I'd like to let Professor Williams kind of give his presentation this evening. And Professor Williams' research is kind of at the intersection of New Testament studies and crime, in which he will now present a little bit more on.
All right. Thank you so much, Anuj and Professor Penn for this great invitation. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight, and so so that you can have something to look at as we are engaging. I look forward to both this moment, and I also get really excited about Q&A. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for that at the end. All right, let's get into it. How Roman criminal law shaped Christian origins. Now, for some, this title may seem a bit strange, but hopefully over the course of our time together, the connections will become clearer. And now I begin a bit with a shameless plug. I received news earlier today that my book is scheduled to start printing next week with Cambridge University Press. It's entitled Criminalization in Acts of the Apostles, Race, Rhetoric, and the Prosecution of an Early Christian Movement. One of the arguments that I make in that text is that students of early Christianities should tend to the semantic range of the Greek word dioko that often gets translated as persecuted. Here I have noted one of the most popular passages that uses the term from Acts of the Apostles, Acts 9:4, there on your screen. Here, Jesus, in a post-resurrection appearance, asks Saul, why does he diokase him? Often this term is understood as persecution with religious connotations that posits one religious group attacking another for their beliefs. I argue instead that prosecution is a better way to understand the term. And this passage in Acts is particularly helpful to see that because Saul receives arrest warrants from the high priest for people who are a part of this criminalized movement of Jesus' followers. It's worth noting that papyri from Egypt indicate that high priests did have power in certain places to issue such arrest warrants. Also, within the context of Judea in the 1st century CE under the Roman Principate, the high priest would have been appointed by the Roman procurator and thus is a representative of the Roman power structure. That's all happening in Acts 9. And this reality has led me to investigate beyond religious concerns to explain why the earliest Jesus followers are often portrayed and understood as imprisoned and criminalized. I've queried, how would such scenes have made sense within the frameworks of Roman criminal law in the 1st century CE? And what I've discovered is that early Christian accounts and those of people around them provide insight into how the earliest Jesus followers are depicted. Therefore, by analyzing Roman criminal law and early witnesses from inside and outside of the movement, I hope to consider how Roman criminal law shaped how early Christians told stories about their origins and movement. So with this, a useful place to think is around Justinian's Digest. As well as helping to think about Justinian's Digest is Jill Harry's Law and Crime in the Roman World. Jill Harry is a Roman legal scholar. Justinian's Digest is a 6th century composition of 2nd and 3rd century CE jurist opinions, and its influence reaches almost as far as the Bible, especially when it comes to legal discourse. The digest and other legal books published by Justinian, those being the Code and Institutes, compose a three-part volume called the Corpus Juris Civilis. These texts provide insight into the Eastern Roman Empire when the western part of the empire had become politically defunct, and the surviving part of the empire had its capital in Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul. One of the most remarkable claims that Justinian makes in the digest introduction is that it was compiled within 3 years, from December 530 to 533 CE. Each of the three texts is rich with information about the legal world of the early Byzantine Empire. But for today, I focus on what digest preserves, summarizes, and even alters from earlier juris. Focusing on the early juris provides a glimpse into the legal world of an earlier time of the empire, around those times when early Christianities were forming. I proceed with caution because one cannot ignore that the digest functioned as a part of the imperial agenda, which included feigning unity and concretizing authority. From our reading today, not from our reading, but from Jill Harries, which I just mentioned above, Harries discusses criminal procedure and legal discourse of crimes. Harries carefully delineates the difference between ancient and contemporary understandings of crime. Importantly, the Romans did not have a word for crime as we in the West conceptualize it. They had multiple words, words that carry various shades of negative nuance for different behaviors. Harries helpfully suggests that crime in Roman law is signaled by the procedure of public accusation, in which the accuser sought the public through its courts to pass judgment on the accused. The digest in Book 48 primarily deals with the jurist's opinions regarding activities that were considered public crimes. The emphasis on the public nature of offenses is reflected in how discussions on theft are not included in this Book 48 of the digest, which is the only chapter that discusses public offenses that require allegations, trials, and punishments. An important feature of the digest that grants an insight into the legal understanding of the jurist is the separation of the book on delicts from the book on crime, trials, and punishment. The books on delicts is Book 47, but here we're talking about the digest, which is Book 48. Harries, who I mentioned earlier, helpfully articulates that a delict is a wrongful act not deriving from agreement, which causes damage to another, for which the latter may recover a penalty from the wrongdoer. Engaging in these texts, I've learned that, and in dealing with some legal scholars, both ancient and contemporary, I learned that a delict corresponds to torts in contemporary law. So activities under this category were not subject to public procedure, although they reflected damage and injury. The emphasis on public procedure reflects the feature of Roman culture that first sought to address personal offenses through self-help. Surprisingly, for U.S. readers, theft, robbery with violence, unlawful damage, and outrage fall under the category of delicts and not public criminal activity. The individual had to secure their own justice. This explains how a citizen could kill a quote-unquote thief in the night to protect his property, the paterfamilias. Only particular types of thievery fell under the criminal legislation, particularly offenses where robbers were harmed. Now, as we think about Book 48 of Digest, the leading opinion is on your screen of the first topic in Book 48, which again is the only book in the Digest explicitly about crime. It's written by a 2nd century jurist, Macer, more or less contemporary with the Acts of the Apostles and some of these earliest formations of Christian origin. And his opinion sets the stage for the book. As you can see, only the following charges are subject to criminal proceedings. And I'll leave this here for you to look at rather than read the entire thing. Now, if you look at these laws that define criminal activity in Digest 48, they seem to be from another time and quite a hodgepodge. And that was the case even for the compilers of the Digest in the 6th century CE. Moreover, these laws even predate the second and third century jurists whom they compile. Justinian's Digest it looked backward to the jurists, and the jurists looked backwards to the Roman Republic. They looked all the way back to the 450 BCE 12 tables, a cornerstone text for Republican Roman jurisprudence. One of the features of the 12 tables is that any plaintiff could lay hands on the defendant and bring them to a public trial. At that time, the Roman community was so small that the citizens could come together and decide the fate of individuals who have been brought before them. This style of jury justice formed the judicium populi. And one of the worst types of crimes that could be brought before that body was per duellio, or per betrayal of Rome. This will be important later. Now, as Rome expanded, there were various other interventions in the Roman courts and law system. And rather than kind of burden you with all of those, one of the most important ones that would have been around at the time that the earliest Jesus followers and the early Christian movements are erupting is cognitio, is this process of cognitio, which manifests in the provinces in the imperial period. And cognitio, often called in these legal texts extra ordinem, was the process whereby a judge or governor made a decision without a jury. Now, laying out kind of the legal framework, what the laws were and how they were administered by an official, somebody operating on behalf of the Roman Empire. It's important to note another surprising feature of the digest, that if you look at these laws with a close eye, you can already see it. And it's that these laws from the jurists focus on crimes that are committed by the elite or the honestiores. So here's the slide of the different types of legal bodies that I just mentioned. I should have advanced it a bit, but here you can go to see the Republic, the 12 tables, tablets, and then the Empire with cognitio. Now, one thing that could be surprising for a contemporary reader of the digest is the jurist's focus on criminal laws geared toward activities of the elite or honestiores, as you see it here, or the higher, more honorable. Nonetheless, the crimes that the humiliores, or the more humble, could also commit, when they could commit crimes, they would receive a harsher punishment than those honestiores status people. And this is linked to a dual penalty system of Roman law that was laid out in Emperor Hadrian's Rescript. I'll come back to this slide in a moment. Part of why Hadrian's Rescript is important to consider is that it shows that there were two types of justice available, one for the honestiores and the other for the humiliores. One thing to note before I go to that Rescript is that a judge, a Roman judge, one of those with cognitio or otherwise, the first question that they would ask someone who came before them, whether a witness or defendant, was, what is your condition, or what is your rank? And I have Xenos here to let us see that the word where we get xenophobic from is linked to a foreigner or a stranger. And we can see here that part of the judicial process was to see where did one fit, how did their body map onto various statuses, the honorable, the humiliores, or an outsider. These were parts of what was at stake in a judicial court in the Roman world. And so, as I mentioned, in these two types of penalty, Peter Garnsey highlights this two-tier system of punishment, one for those with higher status and another for those with lower status. This could seem strange, but unfortunately, this aspect of Roman law is really not unfamiliar to many of us in the U.S. context at all. But what is noteworthy, as I mentioned a little bit before, is that the Roman criminal law's focus was on the elite. Of the 11 criminal laws mentioned in Mesa in Digest 48, 7 could only be performed by the elite through wealth, position, or both. And this illustrates that the law, especially from Justinian's Digest, focused on the elite. Constantine stated that the lower and less reputable parts of the population were not considered worthy of notice by the law. And Harris, who I mentioned before, observes Digest's emphasis on officials and elites' potential to become criminals. And to illustrate this, I want to focus on 2 of the leges Julii, those regarding treason and vis publica. On this slide, I also have electoral corruption, but I won't speak to that too much today, and vis praevita. When I talked earlier about Judicium Populis, largest crime was per duellio, or treason. This charge in imperial times was eclipsed by maiestas, a charge against people who attacked or betrayed Rome. However, it eventually came to depict people who challenged the authority of the empire. And in this way, treason was less about the safety of the empire and the protection of Rome. It eventually moved from just being about the empire and about the small republic that it first started as. It moved to become a form of insulation for the emperor, to the point where significant numbers of the people, especially men with a status, were charged with maiestas. And those people were senators who challenged the emperor, or people whom the emperor felt as threatening. Now, the second lex Julia that I'm considering for our thoughts tonight is vis publica, or violence against the public. This particular crime initially was seen to not be specifically focused on the elite or the wealthy. However, under this title, the jurists included more than the obvious armed rioters that disturbed public peace. They also included magistrates and governors who misused their positions and, in effect, betrayed the Roman trust of the public. This included taking a bribe, punishing someone who did not deserve to be punished, or flogging a Roman citizen, which violated the Lex Porcia. These leaders were prescribed capital punishment for their mismanagement of the office on behalf of Rome and on behalf of the people. Now, from that angle, perhaps the Romans have something to teach us. Now, I mentioned that vis publica. I've talked about how it was particularly geared toward the elite, but I also want to talk about how, in this way, the non-elite could also commit vis publica, and how this shaped some of the early Christian origin imaginations. Here we see on our screen an excerpt from Digest 3 Marcion Institute's book 14 that reads, under the same heading of vis publica come those who have entered into a conspiracy to raise a mob or a sedition, or who keep either slaves or freemen under arms. This jurist's opinion exposes how the people who stirred up crowds must be held for violating vis publica according to Digest. And in various passages across Acts of the apostles in particular, there are scenes where crowds are stirred up, and various figures make claims that if the crowds don't get brought under control, the Romans will come in and either quell the seeming riot or will work to bring the different disturbance under its foray, under its control. And part of why this is helpful for us to think about is that within the first century CE, in the empire, in the imperial period, the charge of creating a mob or sedition or stasis, stirring up people, was the premier charge that could be raised against one's opponent. This is not just something that is a part of this legal study, but also in terms of rhetorical handbooks like those from Cicero. They articulated ad Herennium Rhetorica, they articulated that the crime to call one's opponent out on was stasis. That was the number one type of crime, and it would get both sympathy from the people, but also it was a chargeable offense because public order and public um, peace was a part of the Pax Romana, the Pax a Securitas, this peace and security that the Roman Empire was supposed to bring. And so this is a particular issue, and this concept that finds its place in Roman criminal law within the Digest helps us to think about how people on the ground potentially could have understood the challenge of causing and raising mobs or different types of disturbances that would have earned attention from Roman officials. There's a number of passages across Acts. In Acts 16, there's a passage where enslavers make up a charge that Paul, Silas, and members of the movement are causing a public disturbance in the Roman colony of Philippi. And the sheriffs beat Paul and Silas based on this charge and imprisoned them. The enslavers, in effect, charged them with vis publica, as we see here, or causing a riot to the public. However, the scene is ironic because it's actually the sheriffs who misused their power that, if you remember from before, they are the ones who have actually committed vis publica by misusing their position and by harming Roman citizens. This is just one of many examples that demonstrates how the Romans understood criminal law and how that criminal law, it impacted the way that the earliest Jesus followers thought about their work. And so I've given you a little bit of Roman law, and then I've also talked to you a bit about Acts of the Apostles. But now I want to show how these concepts and this imagination about Roman criminal law would impact not just texts that have become considered canonical or New Testament passages, but also how those outside of the movement and those after the New Testament within the movement saw this process of Roman criminal law, Roman judicial procedures, or cognitio operating on behalf of these early Jesus followers. And so these texts, as I bring them up, they're going to help us to consider the juridical imagination of the earliest Jesus followers. And so first we'll go to Josephus. Josephus was born circa 37 CE into a priestly family in Jerusalem, according to his biography. He was a part of the Pharisee sect or party and resisted the Messianic movements, although he supported the Jewish war against Rome that began in 66 CE and ended in 70 CE with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. He authored a text that narrates a version of the events of that war, and he writes that he was indeed a Jewish fighter whose forces were defeated. He refused to participate in the suicide agreement that his compatriots had made, and he was taken as a prisoner by the Romans. He states that he prophesied that Vespasian, who was the general that captured Jerusalem, would become emperor. That actually happened, and he was released from prison and joined the staff of the Flavian administration, which is the dynasty that ruled Rome, beginning with Vespasian 69 to 79 CE. And it continued through his two sons, Titus 79 to 81 and Domitian. Josephus's commitment to the Flavian cause is evidenced in his full name being Flavius Josephus. His switching sides caused many of his Jewish contemporaries and later Jews to consider Josephus a traitor. Not to mention, Josephus was on the payroll in Rome, which allowed him to write. Along with Jewish War, he wrote Jewish Antiquities, which we'll draw from in a moment. And in that text, he chronicles the history of the Jews from the biblical times through the beginning of the Jewish War. Now, in Antiquities, as he discusses Pilate unrest in Judea in the first part of the 2nd century, he mentions Jesus, which we see here on our screen here. He talks about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. And and as you go through this, you'll see that there are parts that where Josephus seems skeptical about the claims that Jesus makes, or that people make about him, especially Judeans make about who Jesus is. They claim he is the so-called Messiah, as you see here, and that he appeared, as they say, to have come back to life after resurrection. And so part of why I offer this is because it gives an account outside of New Testament text. But what is important to note here is that Pilate, if we look towards the center, upon hearing Jesus accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, this is Josephus, a high status Jewish person with Roman influence, us, had condemned him to be crucified. Those who had in the first place come to love him did not give their affection for him. But see, here we note that Pilate has condemned him to be crucified. This aligns with cognitio, as we mentioned before, where the procurator, the Roman official, without a jury, would be able to make a sentence to happen. We'll talk a little bit more about crucifixion later, but I wanted to note how if as we have an eye attuned toward Roman judicial law and criminal law, we can see how these accusations and how the procedures like cognitio manifest in the first in these earliest communities and in texts like Josephus. Now, for somebody who is even further outside of the movement, who's not even Jewish, we'll turn to Governor Pliny the Younger, who was younger than Josephus, born circa 61 CE, who has the name of his adoptive uncle, Pliny the Elder, was born in Como, Italy, and along with his 368 letters, he penned an important text called Panegyricus to celebrate the Emperor Trajan. He was well educated, held many political offices, including the governorship of Bithynia, about which he writes to Trajan concerning his problem with Christians. He seems ambivalent about how to handle them, and some refuse to denounce their Christianity or their Christian identity. He's not sure what's wrong with them, whether it's the mere name, as you see, of Christian, which is punishable, even if innocent of a crime, or rather the crimes associated with the name. He writes, as you see here, that the only charges he has against them are that they also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than they met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternatively among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, scalus here, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust. And so here he's like, these guys seem like they're pretty okay. There doesn't seem to be a reason for Christians to be prosecuted, except for the fact that Pliny finds them to be a problem. One of the reasons why Pliny finds them to be a problem is something that New Testament early Christianity scholar Candida Moss helps us to think about, is how Pliny's concern later in that text is that they refuse to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and to the emperor. And this is a problem. And so because of the way that Roman religion was interwoven into economic and religious systems by these early Jesus followers not participating in the way that Roman society functioned and operated, they were causing a potential challenge. And here we have Pliny again, as this authority, as the one with cognitio, having to make a decision about what to do with these Jesus followers. And also part of the challenge that is brought before him is that they are not being good Roman subjects. And so part of what Pliny suggests is that he forces them to sacrifice, and he forces them to sacrifice because what the Christians are doing here in this text is that they've encouraged other people to stop going to temples and stop sacrificing. And so part of the problem is not only about this belief system, which Romans were less concerned about, But it was actually because the temples had become empty, and part of it, Pliny talks about, is that these Christian practices are contagious in a bad way, and they're harming local religious practices. And Moss, who I mentioned before, helps to show that this connection to of worshiping and going to temples was intimately connected with the political. Even more, when Pliny references selling of sacrificial victims in other passages, he he's talking about how these Christian practices are also having financial impacts for the temple sacrificial economic system that employed priests and farmers and sacrifices and money changes, etc. So he tells Trajan later in the letter that he will not pursue the Christians, but handle them as the cases come. And Emperor Trajan responds that he approves of this disciplined approach. And so this helps to see how a Roman governor, one who would have been in a position of cognitio, would have been thinking about how do we deal with these early Jesus followers? And this is part of what these early Jesus followers are responding to. Now, as we continue to think about some outsiders, I want to mention someone else that Pliny writes a letter to. He writes also to Tacitus. Tacitus, the Roman historian, was born circa 55 CE. He was a senator under the Flavian emperors. He wrote his Annals around 112 CE, which is after the Flavian emperors. He doesn't think highly of the Principate or the emperor's monarchical reigns. And as he narrates the Great Fire of 64 CE that burned Rome for 9 days and left two-thirds of the city destroyed, he suggests that Nero actually started the fire and blame Christians for it. He notes some of the facts that Josephus mentions concerning Pilate and the Christians following the name of Christ. Also, like Pliny, he refers to the Christians as a contagion, and he refers to their practice as superstitio, which Moss, I mentioned before, discusses is a disparaging way to talk about the earliest Jesus followers, and it contrasts them against what Roman practices deemed as superior practices. They considered these Jesus followers practices as inferior. So both similar to and different from Pliny, there's no actual charges outside of the ones that Tacitus claims that Nero puts on the Christians, that they commit crime of arson and hatred of the human race. Part of why I want to highlight these is to also remind us how as I mentioned before, crime according to Roman law didn't think that low status people were even really worthy of the law, but it allowed for Roman leaders to exercise summary judgment over low status people, people who were criminalized by various activities. And here, Nero criminalizes Christians and claims that they commit the crime of arson, hate for the human race. And so, in this way, because they hate the human race, because they have attacked Rome from Nero's perspective, this takes us back to that concept of maiestas from the Digest. So the charges that are raised against the Christians as criminal is that they are attacking Rome, attacking the emperor, and this is criminal activity, whether they are low status or not. Even if they're high status, this is the type of activity that deserves some type of punishment. And so here we see that the Roman criminal logics are playing out, and Nero is actually using them against these Christians. And so that logic plays out, but the data is actually wrong because Nero has fabricated these charges. And so I wanted to bring in these sources to think about how Roman law and Roman criminal procedures help to think and consider how the earliest Jesus followers operated. And what could also be helpful is to also see how these texts, in conversation with texts from inside of the Jesus movements, the early Christian movements, can help us to think about how Roman law functions, especially martyrdom texts, which are difficult to date, but are helpful for thinking about how these early Jesus followers interacted with Roman officials. And so here's a quick timeline to show where we have been so far. We started with Josephus, then we have Tacitus, then Pliny the Younger, Acts of the Apostles, which I mentioned, And now we'll look at here's that passage from Tacitus that kind of got off place. But now we'll turn to Justin Martyr. Part of what we find in Justin Martyr is a framework where he recognizes that he is a Samaritan, second century, early Jesus follower who writes concerning how Christianity as a philosophy is one that is superior to others, especially because he prioritizes the way that Christians have used the law that comes from the Jewish tradition of the Torah. But part of what Justin Martyr's claim and concern is that not only he, but other Christians are being executed and are being challenged, not because they've done anything incorrectly, but just because they are recognized as a Christian. Here, this passage, he writes that Urbicus, who was a Roman governor, ordered him to be led away to execution. A certain Lucius, also a Christian, realizing how unreasonable the sentence was, said to Urbicus, "What is the reason for this sentence? Why have you punished this man who is not an adulterer or a fornicator or a murderer or a thief or robber, nor in a word convicted of any crime at all, but only confesses that he bears the name Christian? Your judgment, Urbicus, does not become the Emperor Pius, nor the philosopher son of Caesar, nor the sacred Senate." And the only answer he made to Lucius was this: "You also seem to be one of this class." And when Lucius replied, "I certainly am," he ordered him also to be led away to execution. So part of what we see in the judicial structures of the Roman Empire here are these very brutal ways that governors and those endowed with imperium could use their legislative power or their judicial power to summarily punish the early Jesus followers. And this idea around Christianity, it shapes how these Christian origins think of themselves. It shapes how they engage with Roman emperors and officials, and how their identity and origins are constructed within these early centuries. Now, another important way to see how this engagement with the early Jesus followers or these early Christians, how this is in direct conversation with other forms of Roman power, the martyrdom literature is also quite worthwhile to tend to. For here, in line with some of the conversations we've already had, this list of names are those people who are about to, in the story, get charged with challenging the Roman mores, or the values or customs of Rome. And because they refuse to leave that, similar to what we saw in Pliny, similar to what we experienced in our other texts, what we find here is that they are living in accordance with these rights of Christians per this text, and they are given the opportunity to return to the usage of the customs of Rome, but they preserve their obstinacy and they receive this sentence and are condemned to be executed by the sword. And so part of this is in line with, as we mentioned, Pliny, that the concern is that they are turning people away from the religio, political, economic systems of the area in which they are, similar to Bithynia. That challenge then demands that the Romans have to respond to get the city working back the way it needs to get the economics working as it should. But the challenge is that these Christians are obstinate and they refuse. Their very presence is in some ways causing various types of riots and is committing a vis publica. And that the Romans, whose priority is to maintain order, here you find these direct engagements with these early Jesus followers, with Roman officials and governors, directly in conversation to show that these officials have created frameworks to criminalize the Christians, and the Christians are resisting this type of criminalization in this type of legal scenario where Romans, particularly governors, were able to make judgments against the early Jesus followers. And so here we find this tension, these tensions that from the Roman criminal law that we looked at in Justinian's Digest, all the way through the ways that these different texts have imagined how the early Jesus followers are in conversation and in confrontation with Roman judicial criminal apparatus, the Roman judicial criminal apparatus. And so it's worth us paying attention to how all of these different interlocking systems are a part of the story that early Christians told, to talk about their origins, where they came from, and what their project is, and the types of resistance that they encountered, not just because of some type of religious persecution, but actually through the legal imperial realms of prosecution that were impacting various groups of these Jesus followers. Now, thinking about this execution and the skeleton martyrs, or this martyrdom text that has been on your screen, the type of execution they received by the sword is a particularly Roman style of execution. But there were other types of Roman styles of execution, namely crucifixion, which from the earliest stories that the early Jesus followers told, they recognized that Jesus was sentenced and executed similar to these people, and they're modeling and mirroring themselves after Jesus, who was executed and sentenced for challenging imperial authority and its representatives. His case, and the case of the earliest Jesus followers, who were more likely low status people, these things demonstrate that although Roman criminal law did not have an emphasis on low status people, Roman officials could still summarily punish people of low status. Such people would have had what Abdul Arjan Muhammad calls death-bound subjects. They would have been considered death-bound subjects. And crucifixion was a Roman form of public service announcement. Do not engage in sedition as this person has, or your fate will be similar. The point of the exercise, as we see here, as we saw in Pliny, and more broadly with crucifixion in particular, that it functions as a public service announcement. Do not engage in sedition as this person has, or your fate will be similar. The point of the exercise was not the death of the offender as such, but getting the attention of those watching. Crucifixion was, first and foremost, addressed to the audience. And part of why thinking about crucifixion as a form of this, as a part of this Roman judicial system, is significant, particularly because it draws some important connections to why I think this type of work and this type of imagining of early Christian communities is important. Because Black liberation theologian James Cone notes, and I quote, that the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans in Jerusalem and the lynching of Blacks by whites in the United States are so amazingly similar that one wonders what blocks the American Christian imagination from seeing the connection. He posits that both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution, reserved primarily for slaves, criminals, and insurrectionists, the lowest of the low in society. And so part of why I examine the story of early Christians in the Roman Empire in this way is because I believe it's worthwhile to chart the continuity and the disruption between the Roman criminalizing of troublemakers and the American criminalizing of descendants of slaves, immigrants, Muslims, and Palestinians. This type of examination provides a fertile ground for interrogating how certain groups are still portrayed as criminals. Militarized police on beats among Roman subjects, whose skin color led people to stereotype them as more criminal, resonates with tanks rolling down the streets to confront Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2020. Such examining can illustrate how the strange fruit of the prison industrial complex is linked to the strange fruit hung on southern trees, which must be linked to the strange fruit Roman officers hung on the cross. Thank you so much for this time, and I believe we have some time for some questions. So I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you so much for your time and for coming here and giving your great lecture. We have a couple of questions, both in the chat and also that I've just written down. So I think I'm just going to start with something that uh, goes back to the idea of this like military Roman police force acting on colonized people. So, how would you say that the Roman laws applied to people in the Roman colonies versus Roman citizens? And were Roman colonies allowed to have their own sort of courts and tribunals, or would it be entirely Romans applying justice to their sort of colonized people? And how did Christians see themselves within this lens?
Thank you for that. Um, and that is now that conversation has a number of levels, and so part of the emphasis that we find in like a text like the jury, like Justinian's Digest, is an emphasis on those of higher status. So those courts would have been primarily reserved for high status people. But one thing to note in the province level, that because the Roman Empire monopolized violence, especially lethal violence, that execution would have only been able to happen at a governor, or officially it could have only happened at a governor at a provincial level. However, there were militarized police forces that were either the Roman troops or local cities had various types of law keepers. In the example in Philippi, which was a Roman colony for veterans. There you see text like acts as an example of like a strategist, which I'll translate as a sheriff, because it was an elected law enforcement official that functioned both as an elected position, but also one whose role was to keep peace on behalf of the Roman Empire. And so there are these local uh, I guess we could call them law enforcement officials who did the work of really maintaining order, so that the veneer of the Pax Romanus could seem as this piece of Rome. However, as one could see in different papyri from Egypt that Ari Bryan discusses, that often those people who were supposed to be maintaining order and keeping justice were not doing their job. So you see different appeals to higher level officials, some even going as high as the emperor, who, if you're in Egypt, getting the emperor to hear what your concern in Rome depends on whether or not they're making a trip that way, or who actually you could get to handle that. And so part of this imagination that the early Christians are weaving around their origins is this idea of frequently running into law enforcement, being put in prison, even confronting um, uh, governors themselves who have this power of life and death, who have this type of imperium, and part of the challenge of some of the resources is that the martyr accounts are certainly one-sided for the Christian stories, right? They have the Christians as heroes, but what they provide a glimpse into are some of the stories on the ground, and how people would have imagined that these courts and these provincial judicial processes operated, where the governor really could function in ways to execute people, particularly Pilate, and in the earlier part of the Principate and the Empire. He was really recalled to Rome because he was crucifying many people, then that and they said that's not okay to just continue to cause this type of mass executions. And so I'm trying to fit a whole lot into that really really rich question, that these multiple tiers that policing and maintaining order function, we all is complex because um it's difficult to really completely unpack, because what we have preserved often with antiquity are certain sources that are those of the elite and those who felt like their stories are worth telling. And so piecing together what's happening, especially within the province and in these lower interactions with courts, it's a bit more of a challenge to really piece together how people achieve justice at the lower levels. And so in some ways, we can only see a glimpse of what's happening at the higher level because so little material has been preserved. But then at a lower level, down amongst the lower status people, it's even more difficult to try to reconstruct. But with papyri and with preserved literature in these texts, and reading in some of the spaces, we can piece together how lower status people would have engaged um, various courts and such in the provinces.
Okay, well, thank you for that excellent answer. That's one that we could like have a whole class on in itself.
Oh
But
yeah.
there's another question from Tracy Schmidt um, uh, that says, fascinating and poignant talk. I was wondering, did you work with the Theodosian Digest at all during this project?
Ah, I did a little work with the Theodosian Digest, but um, but that did get a little bit outside of my own focus. And I did a little bit with the Theodosian Digest, and trying to think about John Chrysostom, and his particular uh, understanding, especially his like Adversus Judaeos, and how his rhetoric um, would have uh, would have been in conversation with um, Theodosius Digest, which is a little bit more contemporary to John Chrysostom. Um, but um, being a person that's in New Testament studies, I was already stretching a bit to go into into Justinian's Digest. But I appreciate this reminder because it also has some really worthwhile ways of getting some peeks into Roman imperial legal processes.
All right, so we have another question.
All right.
Um, so often it's claimed that Constantine, and specifically the Edict of Milan, legalized Christianity. From your research of Roman law, is this an accurate description of Christianity originally being illegal and then later legalized?
That's a really good question. Well, part of like the Candida Moss critique that I think is really worthwhile, that I have accepted, and is actually like really really prevalent, is that that Christians really invented in a lot of ways the idea that they were being persecuted writ large by the empire. In many ways, the empire was uninterested, which is why when I was talking about the martyrdom text, I wanted to be clear that they're hard to date. They're not very faithful witnesses to what actually happened, but they are ways to think about how certain people in the empire, hopefully around the periods we're thinking about, were thinking about how Roman criminal law could function, or at least how it could function as a rhetorical trope in their way of presenting their communities and these early Christian groups. And so to answer the question, uh, was Christianity illegal in the way that it is often perceived as suffering from mass persecution up until it becomes legalized in the fourth century? Um, I think that we kind of have decided that that wasn't really the case. And also, um, part of part of what I mentioned, and it might have been a little subtle, is that it is important to note there were Christianities, especially prior to the fourth century, and even still, right, there are Christianities, and so part of what is worth noting is what type of Christianity did the Edict of Milan legalize, and at the same time, which types uh, did it criminalize, right? Like Arianism becomes a criminal version of Christianity, right? But it is also Christianity, and so kind of leaning into the Karen King school that I come out of, thinking about how these categories around heresy and orthodoxy are much more malleable and porous than sometimes we think. Helps to do some of this thinking around rather than say, well, were people um, criminalized as we could see in plenty because they call themselves Christians, or is it more so important to pay attention to the various assemblages, the way that Romans could wield laws, way that the early Jesus followers understood how judicial processes work, that they could put those together to form assemblages to say that this is the type of community, this type of minoritized group that is at odds with Roman officials. And I would imagine, right, that when you think about like other modern texts, that they become a part of an identity, and by becoming a part of this identity, that that the movement of the Edict of Milan to take away the criminal stain or to of Christianity allows for those who had been reading these stories and leaning into this idea of martyr cults, etc., that it helped to show that, like, okay, we are now able to experience a new level of freedom and to escape some of this chagrin and embarrassment. But whether or not there's this widespread persecution, it's hard to find evidence that supports that.
Yeah, thank you. And it's still left such a large mark on Christian identity up until today. Like a lot of Christians still very much lean into the idea of persecution continuing into the
Yeah,
like for a sort of more timely example, during the first wave of pandemic shutdowns, many people were sort of harkening back to the idea of Christian persecution when churches weren't allowed to meet in person. So I
yeah.
think I think this is
And,
something we would be loath to forget.
and that's really one of my subtle um and maybe not so subtle types of critiques that that Christians have like feigned persecution for a long time. It's almost a part of the identity to say somebody's out to get us. That's the Christian response always.
I'm glad you said it and not me. All right. So I think we are coming about to the end of our time here. This was so lovely. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming to spend your time with us. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that this was a lovely evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.